Welcome to my channel. Please hit like, share, and subscribe. This is Motown Chronicles, Part 8. Diana Ross. Diana, Mary, and Barry must have all agreed not to mention Cindy Birdsong to Florence because no one ever did. March 1967 started off as an exceptionally productive month, but ended up a nightmare. On the second day of the month, the girls were scheduled for studio time with Holland Dozier Holland, and they cut in a single day 3 songs that would go on to become major hits for them when finally released: The Happening, Reflections, and In and Out of Love. Not a bad day at all. Afterwards, it was off to the Duville Hotel in Miami, Florida, and then a series of one-nighters in the South. After the Duville, Barry decided to return to Detroit and tend to company affairs. On the way to Memphis, Florence got drunk on the airplane, and by the time the group arrived at the hotel, she could hardly walk up to her room. Diana was so upset, she called Barry from the lobby, complaining. How's she gonna do a show? She can't even walk. They got through that concert, and the next morning everyone congregated in the hotel lobby, ready to take cars to the airport for the plane ride to the next stop. New Orleans. Everyone but Florence. The last anyone had seen of her, she was on the phone talking to her family and sobbing. She would stay on the telephone, her lifeline to the real world, and spend hours having conversations with family members she grew to miss more every day. Diana and Mary rushed to Florence's room and found her asleep on the bed, a half-empty bottle of liquor at her side. "Oh no," Diana shrieked. "Not again." "It's all right, it's okay," Mary said, trying to smooth things over. "I'll help her. She'll be all right. Just don't call Barry." Diana finished Mary's sentence. "Well, I am calling Barry," she decided, and with that she ran down the hall. Diana couldn't reach Barry at that moment. Meanwhile, one of the group's road managers helped Florence get dressed for the trip to New Orleans. In the plane, she refused to speak to anyone. As soon as they were checked into the next hotel, Diana contacted Barry and told him what was going on. Diana could see that this Supremes machine was breaking down, and since she was the driving force, she felt it reflected poorly on her, Joe Schaffner, the group's road manager at the time, observed. "There's a coach on every team, and if the coach says you ain't able to play, you don't play. Diana was the coach. Flo wasn't allowed to play." Schaffner remembered what happened next. "Barry told me very calmly to put Florence on the next plane back to Detroit. He wasn't angry, he was just disgusted. I put her coat on for her, grabbed her suitcases, and drove her back to the airport. Before we left, she went up to Diana and just smiled in her face as if to say, 'You ain't got to me, lady. I was leaving anyway.' It was the most heartbreaking sight. On the way to the airport, she just cried and cried. She was so miserable and so unhappy. It was then that I knew that success was the worst possible thing that could have happened to the Supremes where Flo was concerned. I used to date her when they were 3 nobodies, and she was much happier then than she was in the car that night on the way to the airport. I hated what was happening to these 3 innocent girls. I hated every goddamn minute of it." Diana and Mary went on that evening as a duet. Marlene Barrow was flown in to finish the tour. When Diana and Mary returned to Detroit, Berry Gordy arranged for them to be featured in a commercial endorsement for the United Foundation, a Detroit area charity group. Along with Flo, the 2 of them would be shown singing and then discussing the charity work done by the UF. The Brewster projects were to be used as a backdrop for the commercial. "Hello," the girls said in unison, standing in front of one of the homes in the housing development. Then Mary began, "The Brewster Project's in Detroit hold." Berry, can we stop for a minute?" Diana interrupted. "Cut," Berry said. The two conferred. In an interview later, Florence recalled that Berry and Diana began whispering angrily to each other. "If you wanted to do it, you should have said something before now," Berry told her, his voice rising. "Now what am I supposed to do?" Diana just looked at him innocently. Gordy turned to John Fisher, Public Relations Director for UF, and whispered in his ear. Fisher shrugged his shoulders helplessly. At this point, Flo recalled, Berry began chewing on his tongue as he always did when he was trying to handle a problem. Finally, he said to Mary, "I know we've gone over all of this, but now I think Diana should do the whole speech. Don't you?" Mary glared at him but didn't say a word. "Well, I don't agree," it was Florence. "And I ain't playing second fiddle to Miss Ross, especially here in the projects where we used to be equals. I'm just trying to be fair, and this isn't fair. Is it, Mary?" She looked to Mary for support. Mary just stared at her. "Jesus Christ," Florence said to her. "Thanks for nothing. I'm just trying to protect you." Suddenly, Diana whirled around to face Florence. "Well, who the hell asked you to?" she snapped. "Why don't you just be quiet? This is Berry's decision." "I was so sick of her by that time, I just kept my mouth shut," Florence recalled later. She said that people who lived in the projects were gathering around to watch the argument, and the scene became embarrassing. After Berry calmed everyone down, Diana stood in front of the two girls and read the cue card marked Mary. "Hello. The Brewster Projects here in Detroit hold a lot of early memories for us. We grew up here." As Diana gave the speech, Mary stared straight ahead. Then Diana read the card marked Florence. "Detroit is our home. Our families are here." Florence's face was expressionless. Finally, Diana read her own card and finished the commercial. Later, George Walker, a reporter for Detroit Magazine, asked Diana how she felt about being back at the projects. "I don't feel like a stranger at all. After all, I left only a couple of years ago. There's a lot of love here. So many children and a lot of love. We had good times here." "Yeah," Flo said sadly. "Those were the good old days." Diana was asked to account for the fact that the three of them made it from the projects to the big time. "We were just lucky," she said simply. He turned to Flo for a reaction. "Just like she said." Then a pause. "Luck." After the taping, Berry's assistant, Janie Bradford, called the girls to inform them of a scheduled meeting at his house on April 23rd. On that day, Florence brought her mother Lurley for emotional support. Mrs. Ballard always seemed rather eccentric, with brown hair that was almost waist length. She had never before openly involved herself in Florence's career. The last time she had anything to do with the Supreme's business was the day the girls signed their first Motown contracts. Because they were minors, their mothers had to be present. With the exception of Diana's mother, who was well educated, the mothers were pretty useless in terms of offering advice and guidance. Lurley didn't understand what her daughter was getting herself into, and Johnny May, Mary's mother, was of little help since she could neither read nor write. Florence and her mother took their places in the den on the gold velvet couch. Mary sat next to them on a bar stool. Besides a few quiet pleasantries, there was no conversations. After about 20 minutes, two tall double doors opened and Berry and Diana made their entrance together, followed by one of Berry's bodyguards, Nate McAlpin. "I think I have good news for you girls," Gordy began. Mary and Florence perked up. It had not occurred to them that good news would be imparted at this meeting. Starting at the end of the year, the group will be known as Diana Ross and the Supremes. "That's good news?" Florence asked under her breath. Ignoring her, Gordy then went on to explain that with Diana's name added to the billing, the group would be able to command a larger concert fee because it'll be two separate entities, two-star attractions, his voice rising with excitement. It's going to be great. I think we'll start it with the next single, Reflections. Reflections, is it? He asked McAlpin. Yeah, boss, Reflections. Mary has remembered that. Diana said nothing, but listened with great interest as if this was the first time she was hearing about the decision. Then Barry changed the mood. Now, about Blondie, he began. With all eyes turned to her, Flo sunk deeper into the gold velvet. Pacing back and forth, Gordy very calmly reprised the points of contention, counting the grievances on the fingers of one hand. Florence was drinking too much and looking sloppy on stage because of her weight. She was missing shows, and what happened in New Orleans can never happen again. He said that he felt that she was unhappy being a part of the group. Therefore, he decided she was to be out of the group. Nobody said a word. Finally, Florence's mother suggested that Mary at least wanted her daughter to continue with the act. All eyes turned to Mary, who was now fidgeting nervously in her seat and looking over at Florence, hoping for some indication as to how she would like her to respond. Florence turned away. Mrs. Ballard, Flo doesn't want to be in the group anymore, Mary has remembered saying. Yes, I want her in the group. Well, what can I do? She no longer wants us. Diana didn't say a word. Well, if that's the way you want it, Lurley Ballard said, tears welling up in her eyes. Florence just sat slumped beside her, looking defeated. Finally, Barry went over to Florence, took her arm, and helped her out of her seat. He then assisted her with her coat. Are you going to be all right? He asked. She nodded listlessly. Then she turned to leave, walking by Diana and Mary without looking at them. When Florence suddenly opened the French doors of the den and walked out into the living room, she discovered a startled Cindy Birdsong sitting there. Birdsong had been met at the airport by Motown staffers, driven directly to Barry's home and told to wait in the living room. She knew a meeting was taking place in the den, but she had no idea who was in there. Oh my goodness, Flo, Cindy said flustered. What's going on? What's happening? Florence, now in tears, rushed by her. Cindy sat down again and waited. I wondered what I had gotten myself into, she recalled years later. As Nate McAlpin said goodbye to the Ballards at the front door, Diana and Mary came into the living room. Diana looked at Cindy and smiled. She hugged her warmly. Mary, ignoring them both, pulled open the gold drapes and watched silently as Florence and her mother walked out into the driveway with their heads bowed. The two women stopped in front of the car and suddenly embraced, holding each other tightly and sobbing. After a few moments, both got into Flo's Cadillac and drove away. Cindy's was a soft second soprano voice which was nothing at all like Florence's first soprano, but she and Mary were able to approximate a harmonic blend in time for a concert appearance at the Hollywood Bowl on April 29, 1967, a benefit for the United Negro College Fund. Diana was really gung-ho about the idea of me in the group, Cindy recalled. Barry and I liked each other instantly. Mary didn't have much to say to me other than rehearsal suggestions. She was antagonistic in a way because I was replacing her friend, and she, after all, was the one who had to teach me Florence's parts. Diana's version of what had happened at this time came out in an interview several years later. We had a talk with Flo and her mother and wanted to find out if leaving the group was really her final decision. And that was really what she wanted to do. She had made up her mind. She felt it just wasn't the right thing for her. Plus, she wanted to get married and have her own family. She was dating very strongly with this one guy, so that's the way it happened when Florence left the group. It was a case of getting off our buns and doing something about a problem, instead of sitting back and brooding about the situation. There were no problems with the show at the ball. No one seemed to notice that Florence was even missing, probably because of the distance between the audience and the bowl stage, and Diana deciding not to mention it. Diana recalled, "We told Cindy that if she had any problems, just keep moving fast and smile like mad and don't get nervous." During the show, we had to run down a ramp onto the stage and sing from this moment on at the same time. So I sang my heart out and got to moving around the stage because I didn't want anything to appear missing. I didn't want the audience to miss Florence. But Cindy stood in there strong and did very well. Afterwards, a party was given for the girls in Beverly Hills, and the guest list included Shirley MacLaine, Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, and Henry and Jane Fonda. No one would have ever guessed that there was any problem in the Supremes camp. The girls were gracious and congenial, never once mentioning Florence's name. The next morning, an exclusive store on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills opened its doors early for the Supremes as a favor to Gordy. Diana and Mary went tearing through the store, buying everything in sight, Cindy remembered. I just stood there with my mouth wide open, wondering how these girls had learned to spend so much money so quickly. Cindy didn't realize that her contract with the Bluebells would not be easy to break.